There are two reasons why I wrote this book. The first is to provide an accessible introduction to the fears and the anxieties of Islam on both sides of the Atlantic, in Europe and the United States. I wanted to help readers who are new to the topic or new to the study of Islamophobia to get a bird's eye view of the topic, an understanding of the history of it and its contemporary relevance. The second reason I wrote this book, and probably the more important one, is to help improve the conversation in the West about Islam and its 1.6 billion practitioners. I think we're doing a lousy job in the West when it comes to having a calm, rational, measured conversation about Islam. We need to do better, and we've got to do better. I hope this book helps Western audiences understand where much of their anxiety about Islam comes from. The historical, the political, cultural, and religious forces that have given shape to the way that many in the West imagine the Muslim other. We need to learn about where these fears come from so that the fears no longer control us, so that these fears no longer fuel politics, policies, and practices that dehumanize Muslims and that lead to discrimination and at times violence against Muslims. I think there are three factors that drive the fear of Islam in the West. The first one is imperialism. For many centuries, Muslims have been perceived as one of the greatest threats to Western imperial ambitions and expansionist projects. I mean, this dates all the way back to the Middle Ages and has continued all the way into the 21st centuries. For example, in the 16th century, European nations clashed with the Ottoman Empire. And in the 19th and 20th centuries, we see European nations and empires expanding into much of the Muslim majority world. Now, with the Cold War, the United States becomes the major imperial power, focusing its economic and political control over various Middle Eastern countries. But it is often the case with imperial projects, there must be some other. And this other must be demonized and dehumanized in order for the imperial nation to galvanize popular support for the project back at home. So there's this long history of Western empires constructing Muslims as the threatening, menacing others, and in many ways we have inherited these perceptions of Muslims today. The second reason why there's so much fear of Islam in the West is that many people in the West frankly harbor strong feelings about Islam but are fairly ignorant about Islam. Most Westerners have not engaged in any significant study of Islamic texts, history, or traditions. Their knowledge of Islam often comes from the media. And in turn, the media primarily focuses on stories that have to do with terrorism or violence, but which rarely provide anyone with a larger glimpse into the lived realities and to the lived religion of 1.6 billion people. Even worse, our knowledge of Islam often comes now from politicians or certain religious leaders or people I call professional Islamophobes, who have other agendas and ulterior motives when it comes to how they present Islam to the public. The third reason for this fear is insufficient relationships. The truth is that there's not enough strong relationships within the West between the Muslim minority and the non-Muslim majority, but personal relationships matter. They break down barriers and they erode prejudices. They introduce a human face into the equation with all of its complexity. We know from many surveys that there are many in the non-Muslim majority in the West who admit to having very few, if any, substantial relationships with Muslims. What this does is it opens up a gap for centuries-old prejudices and hostilities to continue to drive perceptions of Islam. Both Muslims and non-Muslims must take more initiatives to remedy this. But until that improves significantly, the inherited prejudices and the prevailing ignorance addressed in my first 2 points will continue to drive much of the fear of Islam in the West. For those of us who study Islamophobia, there are lots of misconceptions. And so in writing this book, I was really trying to keep that in mind. What am I up to? What are scholars who study Islamophobia are up to? So let me clarify what the study of Islamophobia is about, and therefore what this introductory book on Islamophobia is and isn't about. First, this book is not an introduction to Islam as such. It's an introduction to Western fears of Islam. So the study of Islamophobia is more a study about the non-Muslim majority in the West and their anxieties than it is a study of the religion of Islam. Certainly, in reading this book, readers will learn a good bit about Islam along the way, but that's not the primary purpose of the book. The primary purpose of the book is not to introduce readers to Islam, but to introduce readers to prejudice against Islam. And as with the study of any prejudice, the focus is on those primarily who harbor the prejudice and why they do so. A second misconception that I want to address in this book is that this book is not an attempt to demonize people who hold prejudices against Muslims or Islam, nor is it an effort to condemn people with misgivings about Islam. I mean, of course, I do point out exceptions in the book of people who do deserve special condemnation. I mean, there are, after all, people out there who manufacture hatred of Muslims and Islam in order to generate traffic to blogs or websites, to sell books, and frankly, to score cheap political points. There are professional Islamophobes, and they take up an entire chapter of my book. They are also in the minority. In my experience, most people in the West who have misgivings about Islam are not malicious, and they don't have ulterior motives. In some cases, they're even curious about Islam, and they want to know more about the religion, and they want to figure out whether their own misgivings are justified. And so my book is an attempt to help people like this have a better sense of where those anxieties come from. Finally, it's important to remind people that the study of Islam is not an attempt to cut off critical conversations about Islam or to prevent people from disagreeing with Muslims. This is one of the most common accusations that people like me who study Islamophobia have to sort of wrestle with and address in the public. Some skeptics dismiss the entire field of Islamophobia studies under this pretense that we're trying to cut off freedom of expression. But what they're doing is setting up a false dichotomy. I personally do not believe Muslims should get a pass when it comes to critical conversations about their religion in the public. And as I think readers will see in this book, I do not shy away from some of these criticisms. But one can engage Islam critically, and one can even disagree in a legitimate way with Muslims on various religious topics, while still naming the reality that is Islamophobia and challenging the bigotry that exists against Muslims. These are not mutually exclusive options. And that is an assumption that informs much of my book and more broadly the academic study of Islamophobia.